Great. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today on this webinar. I'm happy to be joined by Joe Levy, Raj Samani, and Imelda Flores to talk about cyber incident reporting and the requirements that are emerging not only here in the United States, but in many jurisdictions around the world. I'm Michael Daniel. I'm the president and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance. We are a nonprofit threat intelligence sharing organization made up of 37 member companies from around the world. I'll briefly ask each of our participants to introduce themselves, and then we will jump into the substance of the discussion. So Joe, why don't we start with you?
Thanks, Michael. Hi, everyone. My name is Joe Levy. I'm the Chief Technology and Product Officer at the cybersecurity company Sophos, and we've been proud members of the Cyber Threat Alliance for coming up on 6 years now. Happy to be here.
Great. Thanks, Joe. Raj?
Thank you. My name is Raj Samani. I'm the Senior Vice President and Chief Scientist here at Rapid7. I've been involved with the CTA for, actually this would be the second company that I'm involved with the CTA with. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Great. And Imelda?
Hi, I'm Imelda Flores. I'm from Mexico City. I work for Scitum, which is the biggest MSSP in Latin America, in charge of incident response, and C-Labs, which is the unit that holds advanced services. Thank you.
Great. So I think, one of the key issues that is emerging as governments around the world consider implementing mandatory incident reporting requirements, one of the key reasons that they cite is that businesses often don't, in fact, report incidents to the government, and governments lack a lot of visibility. So, given that these are, usually crimes that we're talking about here, why don't more businesses actually report cyber incidents to law enforcement or other government agencies? So, Raj, why don't we start with you on that question?
Yeah, so there's a number of reasons why. For me, I think one of the main reasons is this term abnormal churn rate. And the Ponemon Institute often, do these assessments on the impact of a breach. And typically what will happen is if an organization is breached and it becomes public, then they do suffer some financial issues associated with that, typically customers leaving them. And I think that kind of sense of fear about a breach becoming public and the knock-on effect that it has to the business obviously is one of the main reasons why organizations are concerned. And, I have to stress here, though, that this binary approach whereby organization is breached, they lose customers, they're terrible at security, we've got to start to introduce nuance, I believe, because we've got to incorporate things like due diligence. Because, look, many organizations get compromised, but some of them you've got to accept that, yeah, okay, they got compromised, but actually they did everything right, or they've taken the right measures, and we never really consider the nuance of any particular breach. And unfortunately, we're far too keen to go out and be judge, jury, and executioner through social media as to whether a company was negligent or not. And so I think that's one of the main reasons, but there are many more.
Sure. Yeah, and we'll definitely stay away from the trial by Twitter discussion. Definitely don't want to go down that rabbit hole. But I think you're right, Raj. And I think that's why emerging standards of care are so important. As you talked about due diligence, what is a reasonable amount of cybersecurity? Because obviously, if you're talking about, an adversary that has a foreign intelligence service or something like that, that's a very different thing than, a run-of-the-mill criminal organization. Imelda, from your perspective, particularly looking at Latin America, are there other reasons why, companies don't typically tend to report?
Yes, in Latin America, it is mainly because victim organizations don't believe that government agencies can help in any way, because when they experience a cyber attack, they want to recover as soon as possible. The main concern is recovering. So they fear if they report the cyber attack to the government, especially in some countries, it is well known that law enforcement will ask the victim organizations to not touch anything. So definitely that delays in the recovery and investigation process, because acquiring digital forensic images can take a lot of time. So it is, especially in the cases of ransomware. So they prefer to keep everything in-house, fixing the issue, trying to come back online as soon as possible and stop there. But it is mainly because of the fear of taking longer to recover, and and not really to getting a fine for being part of a cyber attack, because in many countries in Latin America there are not really regulations that can impose fines at this moment. In some, but not always, and knowing in every country in the region.
Yeah, and that's actually a really interesting point about that tension between recovery and law enforcement evidence collection, right? I dealt with that a few times in incident response when I was in the US government, and sort of managing the tension between the agencies that were actually responsible for law enforcement investigations versus those whose primary interest was actually, getting that particular entity back online for whatever function it, performed in the economy. And, that's an interesting tension to, think about. And clearly, it's really hard for a company to say, yeah, sure, we'll just freeze in place here and send everybody home for a week while you dust for the digital equivalent of fingerprints or whatever. That's really quite challenging. Joe, anything that you want to add from your perspective?
Yes, I agree that fear of costs or fear of penalties is probably one of the primary motivators. The fact that we historically really haven't had any mandates, haven't moved people to any kind of a sense of urgency or requirement to do so. Fear of entanglements, as Imelda is pointing out, is definitely an issue as well. It reminds me of the old Ronald Reagan quote, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. I think that tends to be the attitude more often than not. And then I think there's just a general lack of understanding of what the benefits of reporting could actually be. There's the broader, more socialized benefits that we get just from information sharing in general. But then there are things that the agencies can do to help the victims who are under attack as well. And I think they could probably do a better job just advertising the kinds of assistance that they could offer in real time in many cases when these organizations are under attack.
Yeah, and I think that, Joe, you raised a really good point there. And this kind of also dovetails nicely with something that Imelda was talking about of, if companies or organizations don't believe that you're going to get any benefit out of reporting, then, why are you going to do that, right? Then it's just a cost. It doesn't actually help you with anything. And I think for, that's true even here in the United States, where there's the perception and, while the US government can probably use more cyber capacity, it certainly, has some very strong cyber capacity in FBI and Secret Service and other law enforcement agencies and CISA over at the Department of Homeland Security. If you imagine yourself in a country where the government doesn't have those kinds of agencies, it becomes even dicier to ask for reporting. I think one of the recently the FBI executed a major operation against the Hive ransomware gang. And one of the statistics that they cited in there, because of the way that they had gained access to the Hive network, they were actually able to see a lot more of the victims of that ransomware gang. They were in fact able to do some notifications to some of the victims who hadn't even reported to law enforcement. And the FBI director was citing a statistic of around 20% of the victims had reported that ransomware incident. Do you think that's sort of consistent? Does that make sense to you? Does that follow from your experience? I guess, Joe, we can start with you on that one.
Yeah, I'd say it sounds about right. It might even be a little high or a little optimistic relative to some of the stats that I think many of us have seen across the industry in the past. And I think that's been largely influenced by the fact that there haven't been historical notification requirements. Whenever we engage in any kind of incident response, and we do some number of hundreds of these IR kind of engagements in the course of our business. And we always encourage the victims to report. And it's typically a difficult conversation because of all of the issues that we were just discussing previously. What we find often is that there might be a will, but there's no clear path to the way. They might have an interest in reporting, but they don't have the kinds of relationships in place where they know who to call or how to notify or understand what the consequences of that kind of reporting is going to be. So I think this is largely going to be aided by education, and having a kind of a mandatory reporting framework in place is going to help over time. But yeah, for now, it does tend to be a shockingly low report rate.
Yeah, Raj or Imelda, anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, so actually, I kind of want to build on what Joe was talking about. You know, I think reporting it to law enforcement has huge benefit. And, you know, one of the benefits that we saw from the Hive takedown was the National Crime Agency in the UK talked about the case that they took on for Hive was because of material loss to the UK economy. And so the benefit of actually reporting it is that actually the lead agency has the opportunity to be able to build a case, to be able to say, well, actually, we're going to investigate this because of the impact that it has. I mean, I will say, I think 20% I wish in my experience, I'd witnessed 1 in 5. You know, we've done takedowns with law enforcement before, we've done victim notifications, we've accessed sinkholes to determine impacted organizations. I mean, you know, in nearly every IR case that I've been involved with, you know, we've had to kind of encourage and say, hey, we would encourage you to report to law enforcement. And by the way, we have the relationship. So, you know, you're not going to have the same, where do I go from here? And, you know, No More Ransom was one of the initiatives that I co-founded. Right. And with No More Ransom, we've actually got a page now where you can go and we've got links to where to report a crime for multiple agencies all across the globe. And so, you know, from an industry perspective, from a law enforcement perspective, we're trying to make it as easy and accessible as possible. And I'm sorry, I don't want to dominate the talk, but the one thing that I will say though is it's hugely valuable to be transparent, because you can actually share the IOCs and the TTPs of the incident that you've had to make it accessible to the industry. I mean, this is kind of why we're with CTA, for example, because the likelihood is criminals aren't going to go, well, yeah, you know, we've compromised that organization, now we'll go and book flights to Belize and take 6 months off. No, they'll then go and hit the same, you know, another organization using the same TTPs or the same IOCs. And so the best way to combat cybercrime is to introduce that level of transparency. But of course, the jeopardy is that, yeah, then all their customers are going to leave you. So these are things where we've got to start to introduce that maturity around how we report things and how the media reports on things as well.
Yeah, no, I think I think those are all really important, you know, important points. I was having a discussion with, you know, the head of Interpol at a conference a few weeks back, and he was talking about, like, we need to get you know, a concept out there of, like, you know, just how you have know your customer, we need know your police officer, right? We need the, you know, sort of, how do you actually know who it is that you need to call, right? And how would you get in touch with them if you needed to? And you need to do that, you know, not when you're in the middle of a crisis. You know, the time to actually be figuring that out is long before there's actually you know, a cyber incident you know, occurring. That's not when you want to be exchanging business cards, either with the FBI or the National Crime Agency or, you know, Interpol or anyone. Imelda, anything that you wanted to add on that figure that I was citing?
Yeah, and you know, regarding the Hive ransomware, actually, I believe the 20% that the FBI reports can be accurate in the US. However, it is not the case in Latin America, because in Latin America, I can say that from all the cases that my team responded to related to this ransomware family, none of the victims wanted to notify to law enforcement at all. So it can be right in the States, but maybe it is this reporting to government agencies is lower to other places around the world.
Yeah. Well, I think this information deficit causes a lot of problems. One of the things that we always struggled with when I was in government was, well, how bad is the problem, right? I mean, we know it's bad, but like, how bad? And is it getting worse or is it getting better? Is it changing? How is it changing? I mean, all of these are questions that are incredibly difficult to answer. And you get inconsistent answers across the industry based on what people see. I also think that, particularly influenced by the fact that now incidents are starting to have the potential for impacts beyond the company itself. If you take something like Colonial Pipeline, right? That incident and its response actually affected way more than just the company itself. So I think that is what is really driving a lot of governments, that information deficit, that potential for impacts far beyond the company. That's what's really driving governments to start implementing these mandatory reporting requirements. Here in the United States, we have a new law that has passed, which is Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act, or CIRCIA. The European Union now has the Network Information Security Directive 2, which also contains mandatory report. Well, it asks member states to implement mandatory reporting. We have other countries like India and Australia that have implemented mandatory reporting requirements. So this is becoming common. And I think what we've all started to begin to talk about on the webinar here, and the point that I really want to spend the balance of our time exploring, is really, okay, we know we can build the business case for governments, but what are the benefits for businesses? What are the use cases for reporting for governments, and how can that actually benefit businesses? Why is this actually, these regimes coming into force, why is this actually good for business, especially given, Raj, some of the downsides you've cited, Joe, the issues you've raised, Imelda, the issues you've raised in Latin America? Why, on balance, do we think that, in fact, these reporting regimes are a good thing, and how can businesses make use of them? So I think that's where we're going to spend the rest of the time sort of exploring in this webinar. And so the first thing that I want to unpack is, we've hinted at a few of the use cases for incident reporting, but I want to explore those in more detail. So maybe Imelda, starting with you, from your perspective, what could be some of the use cases for having this, a mandatory incident reporting regime?
Yeah, I believe the first one, or one of the main ones, is what Raj said, that government doesn't have the big picture, and you also pointed out, it is bad, but not how bad it really is. So having a bigger picture of what is really going on, I believe it can help government agencies. Also, it is important that once this information is collected, if they can give back to vendors like the ones in the CTA, so more detections can be built, and these detections can protect many other organizations. So at the end, I believe the main use case is having the big picture and then giving back to society, but giving back actionable intelligence that really can become in detection and stopping cybercrime. And also at the same time, they will have more information to prosecute more threat actors, more ransomware gangs, and put behind bars the people behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. Raj, you want to, another potential benefit or use case?
So I kind of feel I'm kind of building upon that. But look, the reality is we're dealing with adversaries that are investing money in new tools, new tactics, and new techniques. I know you mentioned Colonial Pipeline, but if you look at dark side and black matter, which of course was the evolution of dark side, the way that they got inside an organization wasn't through, they weren't using phishing emails. They were traversing inside the network. They were exfiltrating data. They were using tools that most organizations use for good. I mean, they were using admin tools in order to understand what was going on. And we need to know that. We need to know that. You need to know that, so that we can advise other organizations and say, hey, guess what? If you see this happening in your network, then potentially there could be a ransomware gang inside your environment. And therefore, these are the actions that you need to take. But we don't do that. What we do is we kind of hoard the information, and it's not we, by the way, collectively, as an industry, we hoard the information collectively. Yes, there'll be blogs and research papers, but typically speaking, there's a small minutiae of the society that are reading that. And so if we are more open and we are more transparent about what we're seeing, what we're witnessing, then potentially we have the opportunity to reduce the capability or reduce the profits that ransomware gangs or other criminal groups actually make. And a really great example of this was the DD4BC group. There was a DDoS extortion group, and they went from bank A to bank B to bank C to bank D, and they went from one to the other. And of course, these financial institutions were sharing information, but they weren't sharing information in a timely fashion, which meant, of course, the adversaries were successful in extorting money from multiple banks. And of course, if they were sharing actionable intelligence in real time and were open and transparent about it, they wouldn't have been that successful. So for me, I think that's a really key point. And, Imelda, actionable intelligence, that is on the money, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think of that as an indication and warning function, right, that governments can perform. And to your point, Raj, the adversaries don't tend to just do it once and then pack up and go home, right, or pack up and go on vacation. In fact, they actually keep doing it over and over. And what I've noticed is they almost seem to do it in waves, it's almost like the bad guys say, hey, and they have their own sort of information sharing. Hey, it turns out, hospitals, really great target, so they tend to swarm on those same sorts of targets. And so being able to provide some indication and warning, as you were saying, to, potential victims, right, helps with some cost avoidance. If government can use the fact of this reporting to become more aware of what's happening and actually use that to help identify potential victims and to notify them ahead of time, then that can serve multiple functions. Joe, I'm sure there are some other use case. I mean, we kind of talked about some trend identification and some indication and warning, but are there other ideas?
Yeah, I mean, we want to encourage cyber incident reporting for the same reason that we report crimes in the real world. It's so that we have a better ability to help our victims in real time, so that we can spot trends, we can determine where we make our investments, we can inform policy decisions. But these points were obviously already well made by Raj and Imelda. The other thing that this does is it helps to normalize a culture of not victim shaming, which I think is part of the problem now as well.
Right.
And then when we have a standardized framework, there needs to be a quid pro quo that comes with this, and I'm sure we'll spend a little bit of time talking about it. But if there's a mandatory reporting component, there has to be a complementary expectation that there's going to be some protections on the other side. So the protections are really where we begin to see some of the benefits, and those two just need to travel in packs.
Yeah. And I think when you start to look at the regimes that we're talking about, right, and I think there are several aspects of this that need to be considered. One is, that I think that, and if you actually look at CERCIA, they did this, right, which is just because you report to CISA, right, and law enforcement does not automatically mean that information will flow to regulators inside the government. And that reported information cannot be used as the basis for regulatory action. That's the example of the kind of protections that I think you're talking about, Joe, there. Now, that does not stop a regulator from then, if an incident becomes public, it doesn't provide like liability protection in the sense that you can't be investigated. It just means that that report itself can't be the basis for an investigation.
That's right. Yeah, the last
Yeah.
thing we'd want is a system where we encourage reporting and then that reporting goes on to do harm to the reporter. So we need to make
Right.
sure those protections are there.
Right. And I also think you have to balance that against, like, you also don't want to just provide blanket immunity, because sometimes there are companies that have in fact actually been negligent. Those should be held accountable for improving their cybersecurity. If they have deliberately been, willfully been saying, no, we're not going to invest in cybersecurity, we'd rather, spend it on other things, then they should be held accountable for that. It's just that that's not most companies, I think, is the issue. I think also, being able to do the impact and harm assessment across the economy. This gets at Raj, this gets at your point about, the National Crime Agency saying, hey, this is actually having a measurable impact on the UK economy. Like, this is actually something that we need to focus on, right? That actually can help drive resource allocations inside governments, which I think is really, and, encourage cross-governmental, assistance. So as we think about, sort of how governments structure these, these kinds of requirements, what are some of the other factors that governments should consider when, building these kinds of reporting regimes? And I'll just open that up. Anybody wants to jump on that they can. Raj?
Yeah, so this is where it gets complicated, because there has to be a clear definition of what an incident is. There has to be a clear definition of the potential harm. I mean, you used NIS directive earlier, but equally we have to consider things like GDPR, right? So, is personally identifiable is the loss of personally identifiable information cause to warrant a notification? And so, even in Australia, I think the laws in Australia were talking about, I think it was significant harm. I think there was a specific term that they used. And so being prescriptive and using objectivity here becomes key, because, I think one of the laws were, I think this was in Europe, and it said, oh, you've got to do notification within 72 hours of being notified. Okay, well, being notified of what? And actually, does accessing a network or exfiltration determine notification? And so we've got to be as prescriptive as we can, and ideally, and I know this is something we're going to talk about later, try to have harmonization, because most organizations today are global in nature, and certainly most enterprises are global in nature. And having varying differing standards around the theft of information related to data subjects even in the US, right? If there's a Californian citizen, we do X. If it's a Finnish person, we do Y. It's an absolute minefield. And so harmonization will be critical, but actually being objective and being prescriptive about what gets notified and what does not has to happen. Today, it's just an alphabet soup of acronyms and different laws and different regulations, and that's really difficult.
Yeah, and I think your point about defining a substantial, significant, whatever modifier you put in front of incident, right, is really important, because we also don't want to overwhelm the government system with useless reports, right? I mean, for example, like if to me, right, an incident is not, they tried to get in and failed. Like, that's not an incident, right? That's hardly even an event, let alone an incident, right? So at the same time, we also don't want to set the definition so high that, like, there's 2 reports a year, right? That fall under that, because we know that it's probably worse than that. So I think definitely working on that, that definition is super important. Joe, other factors that government should consider?
Oh boy, I think we could probably do an hour webinar just on feedback to CERCIA itself, and CTA has already provided a good set of feedback on it. But I mean, the criticisms, and there's never a lack of criticism when it comes to any proposed legislation. the criticisms come down to, just as Raj was saying, clarity, like, am I a covered entity? What is a covered cyber incident? We have 16 sectors of critical infrastructure, and people tend to think of that as, our water and our energy systems, but there's also commercial and information technology in there. So that vast majority of business could categorically fall into one of these 16 sectors. Then the next question is, okay, am I a covered entity? And being able to make that determination it's not straightforward at this point. We don't have any kind of harmonization across any of the other regimes right now. So if an entity has to report, do they have to report to multiple regulatory entities? Is there any kind of an expectation of information sharing that's happening? There's a lot that hasn't been thought through yet. Hopefully, when we get to the latter stages of what's happening with CERCIA now, when we get to the notice of proposed rulemaking, we have an opportunity to address some of these things. But I don't want to go so far as to say that it's raising more questions than it's answering at this point, but it's definitely left a lot of unanswered questions.
Yeah, no, and I think that defining, who the requirement falls on is incredibly important. And it may be different in different sectors, right? And it's going to be hard to define some specific rules. Even size, is not necessarily a reliable guide, because in some instances you've got small, electric co-ops or water systems supplying, power and water to critical government facilities, right? And so we care about those. So I think that it's going to be incredibly complex. Imelda, any thoughts on what government should consider as they're thinking about these?
Yeah, I believe in general, this is something that must be kept simple. The simpler, the better. Because if it is complex, it's going to be even more difficult for organizations to adopt the practice. Another consideration that I believe is important is that organizations submit their reports once they finish the investigation, because like you said before, 72 hours, I believe it was Raj, 72 hours after what? But if it is after finishing the report, it is likely the organization is going to have enough information to provide value. Otherwise, what the organization will report it could be useless, because in my experience, and I believe it is the experience for everybody, that the investigation takes some time. Sometimes it takes weeks and sometimes even months. So if the reporting is done in the first stage of the organization, you only have one piece of the whole picture, not everything. So I believe those are my two main points in this case.
Yeah, I mean, in the Cyber Threat Alliance and the Institute for Security and Technology, along with about 8 or 9 other companies, developed a framework that we actually submitted as comments, Joe, to the initial request for information for DHS when it's considering writing the regulations to implement CERCIA. And Imelda, one of the points that we made in there was you have to keep the reporting requirements simple for several reasons. One is, you're asking, by definition, if companies are experiencing an incident that is worth reporting to the government, they're having a really bad day, right? They are having a bad day. And so you're asking them to report when they've got a lot of other issues on their mind, including what you were talking about earlier, getting things back online. Second, one of the other points we made is, well, I've long had a saying, anybody who's heard me talk knows that one of my favorite sayings is the first report about a cyber incident is wrong. Right? It's wrong in some way. And not because people are malicious or they're stupid or whatever. It's just wrong because you learn more as you go along. And so one of our recommendations in that framework was you've got to allow for, if you are going to require reporting within a certain number of hours, then you're going to also have to allow for updates. And you're going to have to accept the fact that the first report you got may turn out to in fact be wrong. And that the incident isn't as bad as you were initially told, or it might be worse. And again, that's not due to malfeasance on the part of the reporting entity, just you learn more as you go along. And so I think, sort of governments understanding that that level of uncertainty is going to really be key. I think as we, also talk through this, are there places that you have seen that have developed good practices? Are there, places where you're trying to draw on that you point people to, either in the private sector or from governments or other places like that? Raj, have you, examples of best practices someplace?
Well, I'm going to be a little biased, so I do apologize. I think the European Cybercrime Center in The Hague is a real beacon of light, because not only has that organization, worked with private sector on the launch of No More Ransom, they've also done a lot to bring a degree of coordination between law enforcement agencies. So the JCAT, which is the Joint Cybercrime Action Task Force, is made up of police agencies from across the globe. And, I've actually briefed them on various different ransomware cases. And it's at that point we have the opportunity to be able to work with them on identifying, potential harm to specific countries, identifying the lead agency. And so I would suggest everybody to kind of, look at No More Ransom, nomoreransom.org. There you've got details of where and how to report crimes to multiple law enforcement agencies across the globe. But also you've got the example to get tools to decrypt yourself if you've been encrypted. And so, and I probably should disclose that I've been involved with the European Cybercrime Center since 2016, I think it was. It may even be longer, I can't remember, but certainly, from almost day one. And that to me is a tremendous example of best practice, collaboration, fostering reporting, and work between private sector and public sector.
Yeah. Joe or Imelda, other examples?
Yeah, I just need to recognize the work that CISA has done and continues to do in this area. The CIRCIA itself wasn't just a big bang. It didn't come out of nowhere, but CISA has been working on these sorts of efforts for quite some time, and they've had great resources available, perhaps not as well publicized as they will be with a mandate coming, but things like guidance on sharing cyber incident information, just the amount of resources that they've made available to this point. Now they've provided the water, now they're helping to lead the horse to the water. So yeah, I just need to continue to recognize their work there.
Yeah, Imelda?
In Mexico, in government, all organizations that are hit with any kind of high impact cyber attack need to report to the CERT-MX, which is the national CERT. And these guys are doing really great work collecting a small amount of information at the beginning and sending alerts to similar organizations with some indicators of compromise or TTPs that can be useful right away. So I believe something like that could be helpful for others.
Yeah. The other thing that I reflect on too, there's another rule in Washington that if you live here long enough, you learn that the cover-up is always worse than the crime. And that, in fact, Raj, and you were mentioning this, that there are downsides, right? Companies have been harmed by, breaches becoming public. But one of the things that I have noticed is that the companies that are more transparent, the ones that actively engage and, manage their incidents well, they rarely suffer long-term major damage. And if you look at one of the examples I use is, if you think back, to the middle of last decade, you have the examples of almost simultaneously, both Target and Home Depot were the subject of breaches, right? And almost no one remembers the Home Depot breach from that time. Almost everyone remembers Target. And it all has to do with how they handled that breach. You think more recently with like Mandiant and SolarWinds, if anything, their businesses increased as a result of their willingness to be forthright about the incident that happened to them. And so I think that some of this is actually also about dispelling some of the myths that happen when you actually report to law enforcement, when you actually are, having to go public about what has happened to you. And I think that it's not that there are no downsides. It's that the imagined downsides are often far worse than actually, appear in reality. And so I think we as a cybersecurity industry also need to help with that messaging, and also talk to our friends in the media about how they talk about these things. So I don't know if anybody wants to sort of take that and run with it, and then we're going to turn to one sort of last round of questions on harmonization. So.
Yeah, I want to say something about that. Unfortunately, for example, in Latin America, when a company wants to be very transparent and very open about it, it is not that common that companies do that. That for some reason, people believes that the cyber attack was stronger or something shady is happening behind the scenes. So it would be amazing to normalize transparency around the globe. So nobody feels that pressure when coming out about that something happened.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I do just want to actually call out how the media, in many cases, are fabulous in how they help us deal with critical incidents. And I think one of the first cases I ever did was the B-Bone botnet, and I remember Rafael Sata, who's now at Reuters, actually was Associated Press, but he did the story for us. And he did it in such a way that, because what we needed to do was we needed to get the message out there that, I think there was our initial estimates were 2,000 victims. And on day one, we had 37,000 connections to our sinkhole. So we knew that our estimates were well off. But actually, with the Associated Press, we were able to get the story out, and we were able to notify victims to go and get we had a Stinger tool to remove the malware from the system. And so I think, yes, I think ultimately some media write the story because we ask for it. We want to know who got compromised and who did the stealing, right? Attribution and victim. But actually, there is a real wealth of tremendous journalists out there that are actually digging into the story a lot better and detailing facts about the case and providing victims and potential victims access to actionable intelligence indicators that can protect them as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually really important. And like with many areas, just as the policy capability has grown within many governments, the understanding within, media, the number of reporters who can report effectively on cybersecurity has also increased over the last decade. And that's, been really good to see. So I think as we head towards kind of our last few minutes here, Raj touched on the issue, and actually we've all sort of talked about this, the issue of harmonization. Here in the United States, there are, we have a crazy quilt pattern of regulators when it comes to things like privacy, but we have a number of financial regulators. So that's just within the United States. And then if you talk about a company that has to do business globally, you're potentially facing, literally hundreds of, reporting regimes. And so that's just almost an untenable situation. And I think one of the things that we really have to talk about is this harmonization idea. And Joe, maybe I'll just start with you for this. Can you sort of elaborate on this? And then what are some potential ways that we can help drive this better harmonization?
I think we need to look at domestic national harmonization before we look at international. Let's solve the local problem first before you try to go global on this one. Like we need to think about how are we going to reconcile CISA reporting requirements with FBI Secret Service. So there needs to be some sort of a well understood agreement of how information sharing is going to work among local agencies first. In order for that to happen, it's going to require a set of agreed upon standards for things like what's going to trigger a report, what are the requirements, what are the formats of how the information is going to be shared, what are the deadlines. One of the worst things as a reporter you could deal with is having to manage multiple deadlines simultaneously. So standardizing on that domestically first, I think is going to be a big step forward for us. Once we agree on a set of local standards and local sharing practices, then I think we can look at expanding it across borders. And we've got a number of other countries that are beginning to introduce similar legislation, as we pointed out, EU, Australia, India. It's still quite early, is the good news. Like it reminds me of there's always an XKCD comic, but it reminds me of the XKCD comic that says, we have 12 different standards. We need to come up with something that'll unify all of them. And then the next pane is we have 13 standards. So that's the last thing we want to allow happen at this point. While we're early, and we are relatively early, now's the time that we want to think about how are we actually going to standardize the way that this works.
Yeah, and it's interesting, here in the United States, one of the things that we have for when you're applying to university is there's actually something called the Common Application. Where most of the universities in the United States have adopted this common application, so you can use the same application with some different, appendices, but you can basically use the same application to apply to multiple universities. And I think we need to be looking at the same sort of concept, even internationally. Like, can we agree that even if you're going to have to report to a whole bunch of different entities, if they're at least using the same format, you can reuse the same report multiple times, because most of the information that a government is going to want is going to be the same from government to government and from law enforcement agency to law enforcement agency. So Raj, what do you think on this, on the harmonization front?
Yeah, I'm going to take a slightly different tack to Joe, which is, I think we need to look at ourselves in the mirror as well. Look, I love this industry. It is. Yeah, it's probably the most exciting career to be in. But the one thing that we don't do is we don't work well together. And Michael, my biggest bugbear has been the who is going dark.
Yes.
GDPR, and every time I get on the phone to Michael, I complain for ages about it. But here's the interesting part. When GDPR was initially introduced, you had the privacy groups in the privacy industry working together collaboratively, providing a consistent voice, being able to articulate why, GDPR was important. I think the security industry figured this out after the law went, or after the regulation went public, and we went, oh, hang on, so we can't use who is for investigations. Oh, what do we do now? And even today, we haven't collectively got together and said, oh, by the way, this is what we need, and this is why we need it. So we can sit here and say, well, government should do X and government should do Y. But quite frankly, I think we need to look at ourselves and say, hey, the CTA has 37 members. Why doesn't it have 237 members? And why isn't everybody kind of coming in and going, right, well, this is the view of the cybersecurity industry, and this is what we would like. And then perhaps governments can kind of listen to the challenges that we see day to day and consider us, rather than 50, 60, 70 different, groups coming in and kind of giving all these varying different viewpoints.
That's a good point. And, making sure that you're balancing the impact on different, privacy and security, even as you're doing these reporting requirements, is super important. All right, Imelda, I'm going to give you the last word here. So.
Yeah, I believe you almost said everything, but I would like to add that we as an industry all speak the MITRE framework attack. We can speak some reporting framework that this industry can create. So I believe it is a universal framework that is easy to be followed. And these mandatory requirements are based in this framework. Even the cybersecurity and incident response firms can help the victim organizations to provide that information that can be used to submit for the reporting. So I just wanted to add that.
Oh, great. Well, Imelda, Joe, Raj, I want to thank you very much for joining me for this conversation. As Joe, as you pointed out, we could have a whole hour-long discussion on like 2 or 3 of the different points that we were trying to unpack here. So this is clearly an area that there'll be a lot more work in, a lot more discussion in. This is something that matters to the cybersecurity industry, and I appreciate you joining me to help foster that conversation. But I think there's a lot more work to be done, and I look forward to continuing the conversation in the future. But I just want to say thanks again for joining us, and thank you everyone who joined us to listen to this webinar. Thank you very much.